Welcome to Ask Psych Sessions with Marianne Lloyd, where we ask some of the best teachers we know questions from you, our audience. This is a two-part series featuring interviews aimed at amplifying the conversation around equity, diversity, and inclusion in the classroom and in higher education. It is meant to be practical, to help everyday teachers like us identify and engage in steps toward inclusive pedagogical practices and systemic changes. No matter where you are in your understanding of equity, diversity, and inclusion, we think you will find these conversations helpful and enlightening. And now, please enjoy EDI Ask Psych Sessions with Marianne Lloyd.
Thanks for joining us in our continuing series about having classroom conversations, particularly around race and racism. Our next guest is Stacey Jackson, who is speaking to us from the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire. Thanks for joining us today, Stacey.
Thank you for having me.
So before we get started, I'll admit that I don't know a lot about University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire. Can you tell our listeners what you teach, how big the classes are, maybe a little bit about, sort of who your students are? That would be helpful.
Yeah, so the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire is a part of the UW systems. It's a liberal arts institution in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. I am fairly new to Eau Claire myself, and really Wisconsin myself. But it's about an hour and a half away from Minneapolis, Minnesota, to just kind of give you a sense of which part of the state Eau Claire falls. I've been teaching here. I just finished up my third year in the psychology department. I teach a variety of different courses: intro to psychology, a graduate counseling course, theories of counseling, abnormal psychology, and a Black psychology course here. My research essentially focuses on African American mental health. That's what my training is in. I'm a counseling psychologist as far as my training is concerned, and I'm also a clinician at the counseling center here at the university. My research mainly focuses, again, on minority mental health and really the impact of things like racism and discrimination on minority mental health. Their mental health outcomes, experiences on various institutions and campuses, things like racial socialization practices by parents and things of that nature. So that's what my research has focused on. And those are the courses that I teach. The intro courses are much larger courses at max. My intro courses have had about 96 students in them. The counseling graduate course I teach is usually about 9. That's the size of that school psychology graduate program that we have here. My theories of counseling class, abnormal psychology, as well as Black psychology, all of those are in and around 25 to 32-ish students in each of them. So kind of more of your seminar type courses, a lot of discussion and things like that happen in those classes. But all of these courses are courses in which I have the discussion about race and racism in all of them and find it important and essential to do so.
All right, thanks. Well, then if you are up for it, I would love us to jump into the class that I'm going to guess the most listeners teach, and that's intro psych. Now, I haven't taken it since the 90s, but I am pretty sure that it did not come up. And you're right, it probably should, as you even just said about your research area. This has an impact on mental health. So would you mind talking a little bit about how you approach this in intro psych? Is it part of the textbook that you use? Do you supplement? Just give our listeners some ideas, maybe if they're interested right now in maybe bringing this into their intro psych. And if then you want to talk about abnormal too, please do.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm trying to think in my training, at what point in time I got introduced to the discipline of Black psychology. But it was either in an intro class or it might have been a social psychology class. But in talking about things like learning, more specifically, and intelligence and stuff like that, especially in intro, one of the things that really struck me when I learned about Black psychology was just some of the earlier intelligence tests that was being done, not just within the field of psychology, but in a variety of other disciplines too, to really sort of reinforce the idea that society had at the time with regards to Blacks being intellectually inferior in comparison to whites. This research was being done at a time where there were Black individuals who weren't, in the field of psychology. It was done at a time where obviously, enslavement was taking place and even following that. And so obviously the mentality of Blacks being inferior in comparison to whites isn't something new or shocking. And so for various disciplines to be doing research around that idea or to support that idea isn't super shocking. But I just remember when I was learning about that and learning about, what these cognitive and intelligence tests looked like and how they went about testing intelligence and the terms that they used and how it really was based off and rooted off of, white cultural norms and things that really only white people would understand, but being applied to everyone and used to understand or define everyone's intellectual abilities based off of something that's only rooted and geared in one particular culture. It was when I started to learn about that I was like, wow, like this is really interesting, but also like this, you can't really have a conversation about psychology and understanding, people's behaviors and how the mind works when you only compare it to one particular kind of perspective or one particular sort of culture or things like that. And so I just remember being like, wow, that's really interesting. Now my education, for both undergrad and my master's degree were at historically Black institutions. And so for that to come up in an intro or even a social psychology class, I think is just kind of normal based on the type of institution that I was at. But I have always made it a point to myself that regardless of the institution that I teach at, this is something that should be exposed to people, especially early on in their career and learning and understanding and really becoming passionate about psychology. Especially, my background and I'm trained in counseling. And so I'm a clinician. And when I think about clinically working with different groups of people, you absolutely have to think about, things like race and culture and the role that those things play in the clinical work that you do. But to have that mentality at that point in time, you kind of have to get that mentality from the start. So for me, an intro and how I infuse it in intro tends to be when we talk about intelligence and we talk about cognition, when we talk about social psychology and how you interact with other people, we talk about worldview, and that's where race and stereotypes and prejudice and things like that come up. I absolutely talk about it when I talk about all of the clinical stuff, when I talk about what abnormal behavior is, who is determining what is normal versus abnormal behavior and how does that impact different racial groups. Trying to think of other places where I incorporate it. And in addition to, and definitely stop me if I'm talking too much, but in addition to those specific areas, I'm always in just about every section that I talk about, I'm always having people think about, if you think about the group that you come from, or if you think about, your parents or peers, like, does this sound like it would apply to them? Does this understanding of how people learn, how people interact with other people, memory, all of these different things, does this sound like, does it resonate with you? Or does something about your experience make you think, I don't know if this fully applies to me, and maybe why is that? This isn't something that's out of a specific textbook. A lot of times I supplement this with other materials. Daryl and Donald Sue, David and Daryl Sue, brothers have a lot of different textbooks that really incorporate race and culture into various aspects of psychology. I know they have an abnormal psychology text. They have a lot of counseling texts. That's their training. But oftentimes I'll pull from their work. Oftentimes I'll pull from just some of the Black psychology work that I do. Sometimes I'll just pull from empirical articles. But that's oftentimes where I'll plug it in intro and abnormal, because I think you mentioned abnormal too. Absolutely, when talking about certain diagnoses and talking about how that is presented and talking about treatment, I definitely will bring up race in those areas as well.
So that is helpful. Just if I can ask kind of a follow-up question, when you sort of present the historical stuff around intelligence, do you then, this is not my area, so I'm just guessing here, right? So I know in our school district, one of the chronic conversations is that we have tracking. Mm-hmm. So white students are disproportionately in honors classes and Black students are disproportionately in whatever you call the, sort of catch-up classes. Mm-hmm. Do you sort of talk about how this is happening now? And then do you also ever get to sort of talk about kind of the misunderstanding of kind of the positive aspects of other groups, right? That idea of a deficit model. Like, are you explicit about,
So that, because of timing, I mean, anyone who teaches intro especially knows that there's a whole ton of material you have to cover in a very short period of time. So for me, it really is just grazing the surface in intro. So we don't necessarily talk about achievement gap. We don't necessarily talk about kind of a deficit model in depth. The terms come up, but we don't go into it in depth just by virtue of like our intelligence section is like 2 lectures and that's it. So we don't, and a portion of that lecture gets into that race piece. Similarly, with abnormal, we don't go into as much depth with regards to these things. Now, in my Black psychology chorus, everything that you described, we definitely go into far more detail about. I mean, in my Black psychology course, we talk about intelligence and education for 4 different lectures. So we spend a lot more time talking about exactly what it is that you mentioned. Just because it helps to better, I guess, conceptualize the Black experience as a whole, particularly within the institution of education, and then how that impacts mental health. And so that with my Black psychology course, that's essentially, we cover a variety of different kind of topical areas and how that influences the Black experience and how that influences mental health outcomes and things like that. So in my Black psychology course, we go into far more detail because we have the time to do so. In a class like intro and a class like abnormal psychology, it's more grazing the surface. And I oftentimes will say, I teach a class called Black psychology. And if you want to go into this more in detail, that's where you can get it. But a lot of what, my sort of thought process is with even just kind of grazing the surface in a course like intro and abnormal is, again, really getting psychology students to think about the role that things like race and culture play on all of these different psychological phenomena that we're learning about. And some topical areas make it easier to have the discussion about race than others. But it's definitely something that could be talked about, even if it's to the effect of, we're reading these empirical articles about cognitive psychology, and we're not seeing a lot of diversity in the articles that we're reading. Why is that? Why are we not seeing, research that reflects a more diverse population, or what, even if it's a lack of diversity in the work that we're seeing? That is still a conversation. That's still a conversation about race, about culture in that way. So it's I feel that it's something that can be incorporated in just about every chorus. But in my intro class, there's definitely certain areas that for me, it's much easier to tie it in than others.
Thank you. Maybe then you could also help with sort of talking about for faculty that that are like, okay, great, this is definitely a deficit area for me in my teaching. Do you feel like in your department you're kind of the lone voice for this, or does your department have any kind of committee that specifically is looking at diversity, or the APA guidelines for undergrad education that do give a nod to the importance of things like culture and diversity?
Yeah, so our institution as a whole is doing their absolute best to focus on equity, diversity, and inclusion issues just in general. Our chancellor very much, actually, I think it was in and around the year that I started, sort of proposed a sort of these guideposts and his view and perspective and hopes for the institution regarding those 3 areas and wanting to make improvements in all those areas. And assistant vice chancellor for EDI was hired at the same time. And just a lot of efforts were put in place to create just a more equitable, diverse, and inclusive campus. And part of that was with regards to the courses that we teach, and not only creating new courses, but in the courses that we're currently teaching, having more of a focus on EDI related issues. And so within our department, we've had many faculty meetings talking about ways in which we can do that, whether it's, putting a statement, in our syllabi that speak to EDI, whether it's including different readings in our course that address diversity and culture or race, or anything really that falls within EDI, and whether it's empirical articles that we're assigning to our students to read, whether it's the assignments itself. We've gone through and looked at different articles that just talk about ways in which you can do it, especially for those individuals that teach courses that it's really hard to come up with, for example, the research that's out there doesn't necessarily focus on things like race or culture or various things of that nature. Like, how would they include EDI related material in their courses? And so we've had tons of conversations about that. I am actually a member of our departmental EDI subcommittee. And so we're often, scouring the research that's out there with regards to how other psychology departments, how APA and different divisions of APA are encouraging the incorporation of culture and EDI, race and EDI related issues into their various courses, and talking specifically about specific courses as well. And so my department is very much working towards making our department one that absolutely emphasizes EDI related issues in our courses and just our department as a whole. And so whether it's our courses or things that we're trying to do within the department as far as recruiting more diverse students and highlighting, the achievements of diverse individuals within the field of psychology and just different things like that we're kind of trying to come up with to show that we value and appreciate EDI within our department, whether it's through coursework or other things that we're doing in the department. So we definitely have individuals who are supportive and want to incorporate this into what it is that we're doing as a department. And our subcommittee's goal is really to try to figure out ways in which to effectively implement some of these ideas that we've had. There's quite a few individuals within my department, by virtue of the courses they teach or the research that they conduct, that are also doing this work, teaching on this subject material. So it definitely isn't just me that's doing it, which is helpful because it's always helpful to have the support of colleagues within your department, and kind of brainstorm and discuss ways in which you approach having these conversations and things that go well and things that maybe don't go well.
That's great. And it also sort of tells the students, right, this isn't like just sort of a sub, niche thing about psychology, that this is really an important part of what I liked in your explanation there was there's both sort of the content of the courses, but then also who are in your courses, right? That this idea of EDI is relevant on both sides, both of what they're learning and who the learners are. So I think it's that having a committee like that is a good way to deal with both pieces simultaneously. So that is a helpful suggestion for folks if they don't have a committee like that in their department, that this, might make them think, oh, maybe that would be a really good idea for us to start one.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been helpful because I think, and again, in addition to the material that we're covering in the course, if we as a department really do value EDI, in addition to what it is that we're actually teaching, there's definitely other things we can do as a department to demonstrate that we really do value equity, diversity, and inclusion. And one of the things that we know within our department, which is probably fairly similar to other psychology departments across the board, is that many of our diverse students, especially in intro to psychology, are not necessarily performing very well. And so we are wanting to try to figure out a way. We don't want our diverse students to not choose to be psychology majors because many of them are getting C's or below in their intro to psychology class. We want to try to figure out ways that we can teach that course so that our diverse students can be successful. And one of the ways I personally believe is maybe having material in there that they can better connect to, that maybe better reflects them or their perspective as far as psychology is concerned, or is more inclusive towards them. When we teach about the history of psychology, a lot of times we're teaching about white men, and them being sort of the founders, and that's okay. But there were women involved in that too. There were a lot of Black psychologists early on who had a major influence on much of what we know and understand about psychology. And so it's helpful, I think, for some of the diverse students to hear about those individuals as well. that can kind of help them to connect to the material a little bit more, and maybe be a bit more successful in a course that, you have to do well and to kind of continue through as far as the major is concerned.
Yeah, and is a notoriously difficult course, and not making it any more difficult than it already is. That's really, I have to say a theme as I'm recording these is, right, this just that, creating a sense of belonging can happen in a lot of different ways. And one of them, like you just said, is, making sure that your intro to psychology, you should want to see yourself as part of this, major, but then the idea is that you be part of the field. So I think that's a nice example to sort of check your, your history section and make sure that you aren't just necessarily doing the big names that are sure to be in there. So that's a good, great.
In the intro text that I use, it's got a very tiny section that highlights 3 women. And it's just so sad. It's honestly like just a little image. And so I talk about them, but what I actually do is I just talk about kind of the bigger piece as far as we're learning about the history of this discipline. And mainly what was highlighted was, these white European men, but there was this tiny little strip about women. And much of that tiny little strip talked about the fact that, they weren't getting recognition for the work that they were doing and the contributions that they did. Some of them weren't even able to get recognized and get that degree from that institution where they completed the work and all of this other stuff. And then I start bringing up, well, could there have been other diverse, voices and faces and people and early on in psychology that were influential? Why aren't we talking about them? And so that kind of starts because that's what we start like in the very beginning of the course, but that really starts the conversation around, race and diversity and just being mindful that these are the people that we highlight early on, but they're not the only ones. And this is kind of the cultural perspective that's emphasized early on. And that's kind of the foundation of psychology, but can that be applied to everyone? And kind of that starts them sort of thinking about that. And then I kind of constantly will bring it up throughout the course of the semester. And then obviously very explicitly talk about race and culture and diversity, ableism, all of these different things kind of as we go.
Great. I feel like I want to go back and redo intro psych now. And I don't teach it. And so it would be a good chance to hit reset. Well, thank you so much for your time. I think that you've given people some really nice concrete ideas for their classes and for their departments. So I'm just very appreciative. Unless there's sort of one other thing you want to leave our listeners with, I think we can sort of wrap it up for today.
Yeah, I think the thing for me is, this is something that I'm super passionate about. Talking about race and particularly within the field of psychology and mental health and mental illness and stuff like that is something I'm super passionate about. I am a Black woman, and so it's not difficult for me to have these conversations, but I think it's an area I'm comfortable with, and whether you're comfortable with it or not, I think just being open and honest about that and still engaging in the conversation is really important. And so I know sometimes when I talk with white colleagues of mine who have conversations about race in their courses, they, express that the conversation went really well, and students asked a lot of questions and were really receptive to what they had to say. Now, these are people who have done their research, have read, have studied, have watched documentaries, have had conversations with, racially diverse individuals to get themselves to a point where they feel comfortable engaging in these conversations and courses. And it's interesting talking with them sometimes, because sometimes I have more of a challenge and a struggle. And I'm thinking more specifically about my Black psychology course and engaging in some of these conversations, because sometimes students are intimidated to have those types of conversations with somebody that looks like me versus somebody that more so looks like them. And so it's really interesting having conversations with colleagues about that. And I say that to say that sometimes it might almost be easier as a white faculty member to have these conversations with your white students, because they may feel more comfortable to be open and honest. Now, you would obviously have to, be knowledgeable and make sure you've done your research and be open and honest about what you know and what you don't know, which is what I also do, because oftentimes students think I know everything, and I'm like, trust me, I don't. But I think that sometimes it might almost even be a little less nerve-wracking and intimidating as you maybe as a white individual may think it would be if your audience, if the students that you're teaching to are also predominantly white. That might help ease some of the nerves and anxiety, especially because one of the top comments I always get from students is, I'm just worried about saying the wrong thing. And they're particularly worried about saying the wrong thing to me as a Black individual, which I don't know if that same fear would necessarily exist if I wasn't Black. So I just say that to say, I know that sometimes there's a lot of nerves, even from people who are well-versed and well-educated and done their background work and, are ready to be open and honest and all of those other things. There still is that set of nerves there. But I think that sometimes it might almost even be easier to have it because that anxiety about saying the wrong thing and things like that might not be as heightened because of that feeling a little bit more safe or comfortable with somebody that looks like them. Versus maybe me, or at least that's sometimes the feedback I get from students.
That is a good point, right? So you should use that privilege in order to, have the conversations that you want students to be having.
Absolutely.
And I think also, just being honest, at least I in my classes, tell students like, hey, exactly, I don't know everything. So please, if I'm off, if my terminology needs to be updated, right? I'm trying to, BIPOC seems like a word that's now getting a little bit, a heightened use of that word. It's like, well, okay, I'm happy. I'm always happy to switch. Let me know. So that's good, right? Sort of at bidirectionality. Students may be more comfortable, but also acknowledge that you may make mistakes. So
right. And I do that all the time, and I've made mistakes quite a few times. So it's hard because the race conversation thing, I mean, not everybody necessarily agrees with what term should be used. I identify as Black, and some people feel like that is an incorrect term, and it should be African American. It's sometimes, depending on the person you talk to, you might get different information, which can sometimes make it challenging. But that's where being open and honest and sort of saying, I don't know everything, or being open and honest too. If somebody says, well, I find that term offensive because of blank, just saying, okay, I didn't know that. Thank you for sharing, whatever the case may be, like that just honesty and ability to be, sort of transparent and vulnerable and whatever really helps to create a space that's safe and welcoming, that students and faculty will feel comfortable sharing what they know, what they don't know, and engaging in that conversation.
And that's what we want, right? Whether it's about that or about something else.
Right. Absolutely.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time, and have a great day.
Thank you. You too. Thanks for having me.